Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Chapter 13 of Book 3 of his work, Understanding Anger, Seneca is going to provide us with a practice that I think we have to be a bit careful with for curbing anger. It could be done in the wrong way, but he's also going to give us a bit of a bonus by looking at the example of Socrates and what more we could actually do with this practice by following along Socrates' footsteps, you might say, in terms of bringing in allies, our friends, our companions, those people who are familiar to us, his familiares in Latin. So he begins by telling us, struggle with yourself. If you have the will to overcome anger, it cannot overcome you. And then, so that's a very nice sentiment. How do we actually overcome it? He says you begin to overcome it if anger is kept concealed and not given an outlet. So overcome, vincere, to conquer anger. You know, anger comes upon us. It has the potential to conquer us and to get us to do all sorts of things. It's up to us to conquer that. And so we can conceal it and not give it an external outlet. Ille exitus non datur. So literally not giving it an exit, right? And how would we actually do this? So he tells us we should disguise its signs and to the extent possible keep it hidden and secret. And he says this is not going to be easy because anger definitely wants to come out and show itself. He says it wants to leap forth, set the eyes ablaze, and change our expression. Now notice what he's saying here. There are bodily signs and signals, manifestations, you could say, of this emotion of anger. And we know that's the case. Now, it's not completely universal. Different people look different ways when they get angry. Some people get red in the face. Other people get pale. Some people, like myself, because of the flow of adrenaline, get the shakes. Other people are deathly calm. Your voice can change by going up, by going down, by being more agitated. But there are signs by which we can recognize in many cases that a person is getting mad. We can hear it in their voice, in their words getting quicker and less pauses, or we can tell by the rigidity or the tenseness of their frame. We can look at their face. We can look at their eyes sometimes. And then, of course, if they've got their war face on, as we used to call it, well, that might be a sign of anger as well. So he tells us that once anger has been allowed to reveal itself outside us, it winds up having mastery over us. So if that's the case, then it's possible for us to not allow it to get to that point, to not begin externalizing itself. And if we do that, then maybe we can keep from following anger's course. So he advises us to conceal it in what he calls the deepest recesses of our breast, in imu, so in the interior, pectoris secessu, right? Pectoris is our chest. It's a word we get pecs from when we're thinking about exercise and muscles, right? Our pectoral muscles are our chest. And this is indeed where a lot of us do feel our anger. So keep it in there. Don't let it come out into the rest of the body. And he's got another thing that he says really quite interesting here. We should bear it. Ferratur, anger should be borne, like carried, you can say. But we should not be borne away from it. Non ferrat. Don't let anger carry us. And again, we see, if we don't conquer anger, well, it's going to conquer us, according to Seneca. We're locked in a struggle with it. And so this is one way that we can deal with it. So he says, the opposite, we should modify its telltale signs, its indicia, the things that show anger within the body. And what are these telltale signs? How do we modify them? Well, we relax our expression, or quite more literally, our face, our vultus, right? The way that we look to people. We can soften our voice, our vox, the way in which we're talking to people. And then he talks about slowing our step. So gradus in Latin, the way in which we're walking. And we could think of that as potentially encompassing all the other bodily, gestural, physical manifestations. Are we walking quicker? Are our gestures more jerky or more aggressive, right? We can actually control those things. Now you might say, well, that's a terrible idea. You should express anger. You got to let it out. You can't just push it down inside. And this is a legitimate worry that people have, right? Oftentimes this is tied in with what we will call a pneumatic or hydraulic conception of emotions. You can see, for example, Freud has this going in his discussions of emotions and aggressivity. And the notion is, well, you've got this energy, or you've got this fluid, or you've got these emotions, and if you just push them down and repress them, you don't let them out, you don't express them, well, then they just go inside and fester, and they get worse. By the way, Nietzsche, talking about ressentiment, thinks that the desire to retaliate, to take revenge, when it's forced down inside, that's when it festers and becomes ressentiment. Is Seneca advising us to do that? Not exactly. He's not saying just pretend like you're not angry at all. You know that you're angry, right? And you're not going to allow the anger to conquer you and turn you into a outward raging crazy person. Instead, you're going to keep it within so that you can do something with it and gradually work on it to lessen it. So by doing these things, he says that little by little, our inner state, our interiora, the things inside of us, will conform to our outward appearance, exterioribus. So the interior starts to look like or be shaped like the exterior. And we know that this actually does have some effectiveness, depending on why a person is doing it. Obviously, if you're just concealing your anger as a way to take revenge on people, oh, I forgive you. It's interesting because Christian thinkers write about this. Paul says, if you forgive people, you heap coals upon their head. Nietzsche actually sees that as ressentiment. But later authors, for example, John Cassian, the great monastic author, will talk about what we might call passive-aggressive forgiveness, where you don't really forgive the person, but you make an outward show of forgiving them, but you hold on to that revenge and anger deep inside, and you're doing it precisely to humiliate them, to make them feel bad. Well, that's not going to be effective here. You have to actually try to make yourself into a milder person exteriorly, and that will slowly, as Seneca says, bit by bit, not all at once, but slowly help you out, and you'll become less angry, both in the situation and in your larger life. Now, here's where we get a very interesting consideration of Socrates. And notice that Socrates here is not being portrayed as the Stoic sage, because the Stoic sage, the ideal wise person, really wouldn't get angry, would he? Socrates does, in fact, get angry. And so what does he do? It says it was a sign, a signum, that Socrates was angry when two things happened. He lowered his voice and spoke less volubly. He slowed down. He didn't say as much. He spoke less. Why? Because that was a sign he was actually resisting this impulse. He was putting something in its way, right? He was not allowing it to proceed further. And then, now you might say, well, what kind of friends are these, right? Then his friends will get on his case because they recognize he's trying to control his anger. He says his friends used to lay hold of him and reprove him, coarguebatur, right? So they would, give him a kind of hard time. And Seneca says, nor did Socrates resent their reproach, exprobatio, of his lurking anger. Instead, he rejoiced. He actually felt joy, gaudiabat, right? That others recognized but didn't feel his anger. So interesting terms here, recognizing it, intelligirent, right? They understood, they saw, they were able to think about the fact that he was angry, but they didn't do that because they were made to feel, sentiret, the effects of his anger. So they know he's angry because he's controlling himself. And they're actually, you would think, creating more problems by criticizing him, reproving him, right? But this is actually helpful for Socrates. So he goes on and he says, they would have felt it if he hadn't authorized his friends to scold him, the same role that he'd assumed vis-a-vis his friends. So Socrates has the idea that, hey, a little bit of healthy criticism is good for us. We need other people to help us out in this way by saying, aha, I can tell you're getting mad. You shouldn't be getting mad over these trivial things. And so Socrates has already set his friends up to do this, and he can view it as a friendly gesture. What does Seneca tell us we should do? Well, we should do the same thing. How much more ought we adopt this practice? We should ask all of our closest friends to reproach us candidly just when we will be least tolerant to that candor. So that's one thing, and not to second us in our anger. Don't let us get away with it, right? Now, we're not as well off, perhaps, as Socrates is. So, this is a little bit risky, but ideally, this should actually help us out. And he goes on and says, against this powerful and pleasing evil, what's the powerful and pleasing evil? Anger, right? Giving into it. He says, we should summon assistance while we still have the sense, conspimus, and self-possession to do so. So it's actually worth a little bit of a digression here. Seneca, as he talks about in other parts, particularly Book 2, views anger and indeed emotions in general as a sort of three-step process, where first we have the jarring or the bite, as some people like to call it, proto-passion. Seneca actually calls it the preludes to the emotion. Then we have a stage where we are confronted with this feeling, and we can assent to it or not. The will is involved, judgment is involved, the mind is involved. Once we assent to it, now we're over here in feeling the passion, and there's not a lot we can do about it. This makes it sound as if friends are actually helping us by intervening at the second stage, or even perhaps in the very beginnings of the third stage. Maybe they can definitely help us out with the first stage too. They know certain things are likely to set us off, so they can help guard us against that. But it almost sounds as if maybe there's a possibility that Seneca usually seems to discount, that we can do something with a person who's already gotten angry but could be still pulled back to some degree. Or maybe it's just the second stage. So he says that people who can't hold their wine and feel the rash, wild consequences of drunkenness give their friends the job of taking them home from a banquet, right? So they're already drunk. Makes it sound like they're already angry. They give their friends the job of taking them home. People who've experienced the loss of self-control and illness forbid others to obey them while they're unwell. And he says we should look for obstacles, impedimenta, things that stand in the way, to put in the way of our known vices. And above all, we should have our mind so composed that even when it's suddenly and very grievously shaken, it either doesn't feel anger, which would be great, right? Or draws the anger deep back inside and doesn't acknowledge. This translation has anguish, but distress is probably a better translation, or even pain, dolorem. It doesn't acknowledge its own anguish when the magnitude of an unexpected injury has caused it to start. And he says that, this is possible. We see people doing it. Socrates is an example. We're going to look at other good examples a little bit later. We also see that there's a lot of bad examples of people who don't do this. So Seneca is suggesting that this is a really useful way for us to deal with anger once we're already on the way into feeling it. We can prevent ourselves not just from acting on it, but from expressing it and revealing it. And if we do that, then, bit by bit, we lessen the anger that we're feeling both in the immediate situation and over the course of our lives as we change, as we break down the connection between the interior state and the exterior manifestations of this troubling emotion.